Meals meant to break you. Inside America's harshest prison food punishments. Meals meant to break you. The tray slid under the steel door with a loud scrape. When the prisoner picked it up, his face froze. It wasn't food, it was punishment. A cold lump of tasteless loaf, gray and heavy like wet cement, sat on the tray. No seasoning. No flavor. No shape that even looked like a meal. Just a block meant to keep him alive, but never satisfied. The other inmates called it the brick. Guards called it Nutraloaf. But the prisoner knew the truth. This wasn't just food. It was a weapon. A meal designed to break him, one bite at a time. His stomach growled, his body begged for food, but after one bite he gagged. The smell, the texture, the way it stuck to his teeth, it was like eating a punishment baked into dough. And in that moment, he realized, this wasn't about feeding him. It was about controlling him. But how did America's harshest prisons come to use food as a tool of torture? And what happens to men who have no choice but to swallow it, or starve? This is where the story begins. The first taste of power. Long before the tray reached his cell, prison officials had been arguing over control. When an inmate caused trouble, fighting, refusing orders, or simply testing the limits, guards wanted a punishment that couldn't be ignored. They tried solitary confinement. They tried taking away visits. But for the worst inmates, they needed something stronger. Something that would hit where it hurt most, survival. So they turned to food. In prisons like Rikers Island, ADX Florence, and Pelican Bay, the loaf became infamous. It was made from leftover ingredients, vegetables, beans, bread, sometimes powdered milk, all mashed together, baked, and served cold. The recipe promised enough calories to keep a man alive, but no comfort, no taste, no joy. Prisoners who tasted it said it felt like eating mud mixed with cardboard. Days on the loaf left their stomachs twisted, their bodies weak, and their minds angry. One inmate wrote in a letter, "After 3 days, I would rather starve. My insides burn. My head spins. It breaks you." At first, some laughed it off. How bad can it be? But as hours turned into days, jokes turned into silence. Men who once bragged about never fearing anything now sat in their bunks, staring at the gray mass on their trays, wishing for even a single crumb of real bread. And for the guards, this was proof it worked. But the day came when a man refused to eat. And that decision pushed the prison into chaos. The refusal. The loaf sat untouched on the tray. The inmate stared at it, his jaw locked, his hands trembling. Hours passed, but he never took a bite. By nightfall, the guards noticed. One of them smirked and tapped on the bars. "You'll eat it tomorrow," he said. They always do. But tomorrow came, and the loaf still sat there, hard as a brick. The prisoner had made a choice. He would rather starve than be broken. At first, other inmates cheered him on. They whispered through the walls, telling him he was strong, that he was standing up to the system. But as the days went on, his voice grew faint. He lost weight fast. His knees shook when he tried to stand. Even his vision blurred. The prison doctor warned the staff, saying his body was shutting down. But the guards only shrugged. "He made his choice," one said. The wardens saw it differently. A man refusing food wasn't just a hunger strike. It was defiance. And in prison, defiance spreads like fire. So the warden ordered the guards to take action. That night, they stormed his cell. The sound of boots echoed down the tier, doors slamming, keys rattling. Inmates shouted from their cells, banging on bars, knowing something bad was about to happen. The door opened. The guards rushed in. And what came next would shake the entire block. Force feeding. The guards dragged him from his cell, his body weak and shaking. The loaf tray clattered to the floor, untouched once again. They strapped him into a hard plastic chair, his arms pinned, his legs tied down. A mask covered his mouth, but he kept his lips pressed tight, refusing to give in. The doctor arrived with a long plastic tube. The prisoners on the block went silent. Everyone knew what was about to happen. The doctor gave one last warning. "Eat or this is the only way." The inmate shook his head. So they forced the tube down his throat. He gagged, choked, his eyes bulging as liquid nutrition poured into his stomach. The other inmates shouted, rattling their bars, some screaming in anger, others begging him to just give up and eat the loaf. When it was over, he slumped in the chair, barely breathing, tears streaming down his face. His body had food now, but his spirit was crushed. Back in his cell, he lay on the concrete floor, too weak to move. For a moment, the prison was quiet. The guards believed the fight was over. But they were wrong. Because the next morning, another inmate pushed his tray back through the slot. And then another. And then another. By nightfall, half the tier had joined in. The prison wasn't dealing with one man anymore. It was about to face a hunger rebellion. The hunger rebellion. By the second day, dozens of trays sat untouched. The smell of the cold loaves filled the tier, but no one touched them. Instead, inmates slid them back under the bars or stacked them in corners like bricks, a silent message to the guards: "We will not eat this." At first, the officers laughed. They'll cave. They always cave. But as the hours passed, the mood shifted. The block grew quiet. Weak coughs echoed from cells. Prisoners whispered through vents, sharing encouragement, promising to hold the line. By day 3, men were fainting in their cells. One collapsed during count, his head striking the bars with a sickening thud. Still, the others cheered him as guards dragged him away, calling him a soldier. The warden was furious. What started as one man's refusal had turned into open defiance. He ordered the kitchen to stop sending regular trays. No more bread, no more vegetables, nothing. Just the loaf. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the same gray block, over and over. But instead of breaking them, the punishment made the rebellion stronger. On the 5th night, something snapped. An inmate tore apart his mattress, stuffing it under the door slot. Others began shouting in unison, banging on their bars, their voices echoing like thunder across the tier. The guards charged in, shields raised, batons in hand. And in that chaos, shouts, screams, metal clanging, one officer made a mistake. He dropped his keys. Every inmate on the block saw it. And in that moment, the rebellion turned into something far more dangerous. The keys on the floor. The metallic clink of the keys hitting the concrete froze everyone. For a split second, even the guards stood still. Then chaos erupted. A prisoner reached through the bars, his fingers stretching desperately. The officer dove, but too late. The inmate snatched the keys and yanked them back into the cell. The block exploded in roars. Inmates slammed against doors, shouting, rattling bars like wild animals sensing freedom. Guards shouted orders, radios crackled, boots thundered down the tier. Inside the cell, the prisoner's hands shook as he tried to fit the key into the lock. Sweat poured down his face. The others screamed at him, "Hurry! Open it!" The lock clicked once. Twice. But before the third turn, a guard's baton smashed through the bars, striking his hand. The keys fell again, skittering across the floor. This time, they landed just out of reach of everyone. The guards stormed in, dragging the inmate to the ground, beating him with shields and boots until he stopped moving. Blood smeared across the concrete, soaking into the untouched loaf still lying near the door. The rebellion hadn't ended, it had only grown louder. Men pounded their chests, screamed curses, some even spit through the bars. The prison was on fire with rage. And the warden knew, if they didn't crush this rebellion fast, the entire facility could ignite. So he gave the order. No more food at all. Not even the loaf. Starvation was now the weapon. Starvation. The next morning, nothing came. No clatter of trays, no scrape of metal sliding under doors. Just silence. The men waited at first, thinking it was a delay. But hours passed. Noon came. Still nothing. By evening, the truth set in. The prison wasn't going to feed them at all. Some prisoners shouted in anger, banging until their fists bled. Others just lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling, too weak to move. Hunger gnawed at their insides, twisting their stomachs into knots. On day 2, desperation set in. Men searched every inch of their cells, peeling crumbs from cracks, licking dried juice stains from the floor, even chewing bits of toilet paper just to fool their bodies into thinking they were eating. By day 3, the block was filled with groans and cries. One inmate collapsed against the bars, whispering, "I can't do this." Another pressed his face to the slot, begging the guard for just one piece of bread. The officer stared straight ahead, unmoved. The warden walked the tier that night, his hands behind his back. He looked into each cell, watching men suffer. To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was control. A way to prove who held the power. But hunger is a dangerous fire. The longer it burns, the harder it is to put out. On the fourth day, the prison snapped. A group of inmates smashed their metal mirrors and carved jagged edges into weapons. Another tied sheets together, ready to rush the guards the second the doors cracked open. When the count bell rang, the rebellion erupted again. And this time, it wasn't about food. It was about survival. The cell doors buzzed open for evening count, and that was the moment they'd been waiting for. Inmates burst out with fury, jagged mirror shards glinting under the fluorescent lights. Others swung makeshift clubs made from torn bed frames. Their bodies were weak from hunger, but their rage gave them strength. The guards charged in with shields, batons, and pepper spray. The air filled with screams, the sharp crack of metal against bone, and the hiss of gas. One prisoner lunged, slicing a guard's arm. Blood splattered across the concrete. Another hurled a burning roll of toilet paper down the tier, flames licking the walls. The prison shook with chaos. Sirens wailed, alarms blared, red lights strobed across the block. Inmates shouted through the smoke, "We're not animals. We're men." But the guards had orders to crush the rebellion at any cost. Reinforcements stormed and rows of armored officers in riot gear, helmets gleaming, boots pounding in unison. They unleashed tear gas canisters into the cells, choking everyone inside. Men coughed, gagged, clawed at their throats. The stronger ones fought back, but most collapsed on the floor, gas stinging their eyes and lungs. Through the haze, the warden watched from the control booth above. To him, it wasn't a riot. It was proof that hunger had broken them. But then, something happened that no one expected. In the middle of the chaos, an inmate kicked open a side door to the kitchen. And what they found inside would spark the most dangerous moment yet. The kitchen discovery. The door slammed open, and the starving men stumbled inside. The kitchen, normally off-limits, was a different world. Bright lights, the smell of old grease, trays stacked high. At first, they froze. Then they saw it. Rows of shelves filled with bread, meat, and vegetables, food untouched, locked away while they starved. Rage exploded in the room. One inmate ripped open a bag of flour, the powder covering his face like ghostly paint. Another tore into a sack of sugar, shoving handfuls into his mouth, coughing as he swallowed too fast. They devoured whatever they could grab, raw pasta, frozen patties, even powdered milk. The sound of desperate chewing and gasping echoed through the kitchen. But it wasn't just about hunger anymore. It was betrayal. They now knew the truth. While they were being fed punishment loaves, real meals were hidden in the back, untouched. One prisoner shouted, his voice hoarse, "They starved us on purpose." Others roared in agreement, smashing pots, hurling trays, turning the kitchen into a war zone. That was when the guards stormed in. Shields clashed against metal pans, batons cracked across counters. The kitchen became a battlefield, steam, smoke, and shouts filling the air. But in the chaos, one inmate grabbed a knife from the prep table. His eyes were wild, his hands shaking, but his grip was firm. He raised it high, and in that moment, the entire rebellion teetered on the edge of something far bloodier than anyone had imagined. The knife in the kitchen. The knife gleamed under the harsh kitchen lights. Every guard froze for half a second, shields lifted, eyes locked on the inmate who held it. His chest heaved with every breath, sweat dripping down his face. The other prisoners cheered him on, banging pots and trays, their voices rising in a deafening roar, "Do it! Show them!" The guards shouted warnings, their batons at the ready. One officer stepped forward, shield raised, barking, "Drop it! Now!" But the inmate didn't drop it. He slashed the air, forcing the guards back. His eyes darted around the room, wild with hunger and rage. To him, the knife wasn't just a weapon. It was proof they still had power. Then he lunged. The blade struck a shield with a sharp clang, sparking chaos. Guards swarmed, prisoners surged, the room erupted into a storm of bodies colliding, trays flying, fists pounding. Inmates wrestled for control of the food, guards fought to shove them back. Steam hissed from broken pipes, water pooling on the floor. The smell of burning bread filled the air as an oven door was kicked open. Through the chaos, one thing became clear: the rebellion had gone too far to stop quietly. By the end of the clash, the kitchen was wrecked, food scattered across the floor, and both prisoners and guards lay slumped, coughing and bleeding. But the most shocking moment came when the alarm stopped. The power to the block went dark. Lights flickered out. The prison fell into silence. And in that silence, everyone realized the real punishment was only about to begin. The blackout. The kitchen went dark. No buzzing lights. No alarms. Just the echo of heavy breathing and the drip of water onto the tile. At first, the inmates thought it was an accident. But then, the heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deep metallic thud. They were locked inside. The darkness was total. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The only sound was the shuffling of feet and the nervous whispers of men trapped together, their stomachs empty, their bodies weak. Then came the sound, low at first, then louder. A steady hum. Fans turning on somewhere deep in the prison walls. And with it, a rush of cold air pouring into the kitchen. The men shivered. Some shouted, banging on the doors, demanding light, demanding food. But there was no response. The guards had cut them off completely. Hours passed. Time vanished in the blackness. Hunger mixed with fear. Some inmates huddled together, others sat alone, muttering to themselves. Every scrape, every whisper felt magnified. And then, a single beam of light sliced through the darkness. A flashlight, held by a guard. He didn't speak. He just shined the beam across the room, slowly sweeping it over the prisoners' faces, one by one. It was psychological warfare. No words, no orders. Just the blinding light, staring them down like prey caught in a hunter's scope. When the light shut off, screams erupted. Men pounded the walls, some breaking down in sobs, others lashing out in fury. But just when it seemed the darkness couldn't get worse, a new sound filled the room. The hiss of gas being pumped through the vents. The rebellion wasn't over. But survival was slipping further away. The gas chamber. The hiss grew louder. At first, the prisoners thought it was steam from a broken pipe. But the sharp sting in their throats told them otherwise. Men coughed violently, clutching their chests. Eyes burned, skin itched, lungs felt like fire. Some dropped to their knees, gagging, gasping for air. The kitchen became a nightmare of hacking coughs and panicked screams. One inmate shouted, "Cover your face," ripping his shirt and pressing it over his mouth. Others followed, but it barely helped. The air was too thick. The walls felt like they were closing in. Through the haze, shadows moved on the other side of the glass, guards watching, waiting. They didn't need to enter. The gas was doing the job for them. The strongest prisoners tried to rally the others. They banged pans against counters, screaming, "Don't give in. Don't let them win." But their voices cracked under the choking fumes. One by one, the men collapsed. Some curled into corners, trembling. Others slammed fists against the floor until their strength gave out. The gas finally stopped, leaving the room in silence once more. The only sounds were labored breaths and the drip of sweat on the tile. But the rebellion hadn't been crushed. Not yet. Because in the middle of the room, one inmate struggled back to his feet. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, but his voice carried like thunder. "They can starve us. They can choke us. But they will never break us." The others stirred, lifting their heads, their rage reigniting like sparks in dry grass. And that was when the power snapped back on. The lights blazed to life. And standing in the doorway was the warden himself. The warden's shadow. The sudden light blinded the inmates, their eyes stinging after hours in the dark. And there he was, standing in the doorway, tall, calm, untouched by the chaos. The warden. Behind him, guards lined the hall in full riot gear. But he didn't need them to speak. His presence alone was enough. He stepped into the kitchen, his boots echoing on the wet tile. He looked around slowly, At the shattered trays, the spilled food, the inmates slumped on the floor. Then his gaze landed on the man who had stood up through the gas, the one who still refused to bow. "You think you've won something here?" The warden's voice cut through the silence. "You've proven nothing but weakness. A man who can't eat his meal isn't a man at all. He's a problem to be erased." The prisoner spat on the floor, glaring back. His voice was hoarse but steady. "We're not animals. You can't treat us like this forever." The warden smirked. "Forever?" he repeated. "You won't last a week." He signaled with 2 fingers. The guards moved in, shields raised. The chosen inmate was grabbed, dragged forward, his arms twisting under their grip. The others screamed, pounding their fists on the counters, desperate but too weak to fight. The warden leaned close to the prisoner's ear and whispered something no one else could hear. The man's face went pale. Then the guards yanked him out of the kitchen, slamming the steel door shut behind them. The echo rang like a death sentence. The inmates were left in stunned silence, unsure what had just been promised, or what fate awaited their brother. And then, faintly, from the other side of the wall, came the sound of screaming. The chosen punishment. The screams tore through the walls, sharp and haunting. Every man in the kitchen froze, listening. Each cry was a reminder of what waited for them if they dared to resist. The warden had made an example. The prisoner was dragged down the hall, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Don't give in. Don't let them win." Then came the crash of a door, the lock turning, and silence. Inside that hidden room, the punishment began. The man was strapped into a restraint chair, belts tight across his chest and arms. On a tray beside him sat the same gray loaf he had refused for days. But this time, it wasn't being offered, it was being forced. A guard shoved the loaf against his mouth. He turned his head, clenching his jaw, refusing again. So they held his nose shut until he gasped for air, then crammed the mush into his throat. He gagged, choked, spit it back out, but the guards kept pushing. Again and again, until the lump of food smeared across his face, his chest, his lap. Back in the kitchen, the men heard it all. The muffled cries, the coughs, the pounding of fists against metal. The message was clear. Eat or be broken. Hours later, the guards dragged his limp body past the windows. His face was swollen, his eyes half closed, but his lips still moved. And though no one could hear him, the men knew what he was saying: "Don't stop." The silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was fuel. Because that night, in the darkness of their cells, whispers spread like wildfire. Plans were made. Vows were spoken. And by morning, the rebellion would no longer be about hunger. It would be about revenge. Whispers of revenge. The cell block was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was planning. Through vents, through toilet pipes, through cracks in the walls, voices carried. Inmates who had never spoken before now whispered like brothers. Every man had seen the chosen prisoner dragged away, broken, humiliated. And every man swore it would not end there. One whispered about tools hidden years ago, metal shanks tucked in ceiling cracks. Another spoke of timing, shift changes, guard rotations, blind spots in the cameras. Hunger had weakened their bodies, but rage sharpened their minds. By dawn, a pact had formed. Not written on paper, not signed with ink, but carved in hunger, anger, and blood. When the morning trays slid under the doors, something strange happened. Every inmate took the loaf. Every man bit down. The guards smirked, thinking the rebellion was broken. They didn't see the truth. The prisoners weren't surrendering. They were conserving strength. They were waiting. That night, the block pulsed with tension. The silence was heavier than shouting. Men lay in their bunks, eyes open, fists clenched, waiting for the signal. And then it came. 3 sharp bangs on the pipes. Cell after cell erupted. Sheets twisted into ropes. Shanks flashed in the dark. A roar of voices shook the tier like thunder. The guards rushed in with shields. But this time, the inmates weren't fighting for food. They were fighting for payback. The first guard to step through the door never made it out. The breakout of fury. The first guard fell hard, dragged into a storm of fists and shanks. His shield clattered across the floor, snatched up by an inmate before it even stopped rolling. The others surged forward, but the prisoners were ready. Sheets looped around legs yanked guards to the ground. Shards of metal scraped against riot gear, sparks flying as blows rained down. The air filled with screams and the deafening crash of metal on metal. Blood smeared the concrete, boots stomped in panic, and the prisoners roared like men who had been pushed too far for too long. For the first time, the balance had shifted. Guards stumbled back, some fleeing toward the exit, others trapped against the walls. The inmates had turned the prison's own weapons against them, shields, batons, even helmets ripped away in the frenzy. But in the chaos, one voice rose above the rest. The same prisoner who had defied the loaf, who had endured the gas, who had sworn not to break. He stood on a table, his chest heaving, shouting over the madness. This is what happens when you starve men like dogs. This is our block now. The inmates roared, slamming fists against walls, their victory echoing like thunder. But then, an even louder sound ripped through the block. The metallic screech of reinforced doors unlocking. The warden had called in the emergency response team. And as the steel gates opened, dozens of heavily armored officers marched in, armed with more than just batons and shields. This wasn't going to be a fight anymore. It was going to be a war. The storm arrives. The sound of boots thundered through the corridor. Dozens, maybe more. The prisoners froze for just a moment, their victory hanging in the air like smoke. Then the steel doors swung wide. The emergency response team marched in, a wall of black armor and glowing visors. Their shields were bigger, their weapons heavier. Some carried launchers slung over their shoulders. Others had thick canisters strapped to their belts. This wasn't the regular guard force. This was the storm. Down now, a voice boomed through a megaphone. The prisoners shouted back, hurling curses, banging pots, swinging stolen batons against the bars. None of them dropped. The order came. A flashbang exploded, filling the block with white light and deafening thunder. Men dropped to their knees, clutching their ears, blinded. Then came the tear gas, canisters clattering against the floor, releasing choking clouds that turned the air into poison. Prisoners coughed, staggered, some swinging blindly with shanks. Others collapsed, crawling on the ground, trying to breathe. The riot team pushed forward in perfect formation, shields slamming, batons cracking. The rebellion crumbled under the flood. Men fought, but one by one, they were dragged down, shackled, beaten into submission. The block filled with the sound of bodies hitting the concrete, chains rattling, orders barked like gunfire. And through it all, the warden stood on the upper tier, arms folded, watching. To him, this wasn't a battle. It was proof that no matter how loud the rebellion screamed, the prison would always scream louder. By the time the smoke cleared, the floor was littered with prisoners gasping for air, faces bruised, wrists bleeding from cuffs. The smell of gas, sweat, and defeat clung to the walls. But as the riot team began dragging men away one by one, a chilling sound cut through the silence. Laughter. Weak, hoarse, but unmistakable. It came from the man who had started it all. His face was swollen, his lips split, but he was laughing. And he whispered to the guards carrying him, "You can't starve the fire out of us. It'll burn again." After the fire, the block was silent now. No banging on bars. No shouting through vents. Just the heavy sound of chains dragging across the floor as the last of the prisoners were shackled and hauled away. The kitchen lay in ruins, pots overturned, food trampled, walls blackened by smoke. The rebellion had burned bright, but it had been smothered under the weight of shields and gas. The survivors were marched in single file, heads down, wrists cuffed behind their backs. Some stumbled, others limped, all of them bruised and broken. The guards didn't speak. They didn't need to. The message was clear. The fight was over. But for the warden, victory wasn't enough. He wanted obedience. He wanted fear to sink so deep that no man would dare rise again. So he ordered a new punishment. Solitary confinement for every leader. No mattresses. No books. No visits. Just 4 gray walls and the same loaf, 3 times a day. For some, it was unbearable. The silence drove them mad. They scratched words into the concrete with broken fingernails, whispering to themselves until their voices cracked. Others refused the loaf again, choosing starvation over submission. One by one, their bodies weakened. The rebellion that had roared with fire now flickered like dying embers. But not everyone broke. Deep inside his solitary cell, the man who had laughed during the riot sat cross-legged on the floor. His eyes were hollow, his body frail, but his mind was alive. He whispered to himself, not out of madness, but out of planning. Because he knew something the warden didn't. The rebellion wasn't dead. It was waiting. And the next time it rose, it wouldn't stop at the kitchen. Seeds in the dark. The cells were tombs, cold, silent, cut off from the world. Each man locked alone with nothing but his thoughts and the gray brick loaf sliding through the slot. For many, solitary crushed the spirit. Days blurred into weeks. Hunger gnawed, loneliness whispered, and the silence pressed like a weight on the chest. Some broke quickly, begging guards to let them out, promising obedience just for a taste of real food again. But for a few, the isolation only sharpened their resolve. In the pitch dark of his cell, the man who had sparked it all pressed his ear to the vent. A faint whistle came through, 3 notes, repeated twice. A signal. Another inmate answered back with the same pattern. The rebellion hadn't died. It had gone underground. They spoke through the pipes, slow and careful, building a secret chain across the solitary wing. Each whisper carried a piece of the plan. Where to strike next, how to use the guards' routines, how to smuggle scraps of metal into weapons. The warden thought the loaf and silence would break them. But in truth, it had given them something far more dangerous, time to think. And as the days stretched on, their whispers grew into vows. Not just to rise again, but to make sure the next rebellion wouldn't fail. One night, the man carved 4 words into the concrete with a shard of metal he'd hidden in his shoe. The words glared back at him in the moonlight seeping through the slit of his window. This time, forever. He pressed his hand against the wall, and through the vent, another prisoner whispered the same words. Soon, cell by cell, the vow spread like a spark through dry kindling. And just as the guards began to believe control had returned, they found a note slipped under the warden's door. 4 words, written in blood. We will not starve. The warden's warning. The note lay on the warden's desk, the letters smeared dark red across the page. We will not starve. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tight, his hands clenched behind his back. Someone had slipped it under his door without being seen. That alone was a message. If the prisoners could reach him here, nowhere inside the prison was safe. He called in his top officers. They stood in silence as he held the note up. This, the warden said, is not defiance. It's war. The guards shifted uneasily. They had crushed the riot, dragged men through blood and smoke, yet the prisoners were still finding ways to strike back. Still whispering, still plotting. The warden ordered harsher measures. Cells stripped bare. Lights left on 24 hours. Every meal inspected, every visitor banned. And anyone caught whispering through the vents would be gagged for weeks at a time. But the fear didn't spread the way he expected. Instead, it hardened the men. In the solitary wing, prisoners began scratching the same 4 words into their walls, their floors, their bunks. We will not starve. Guards painted over it, but by morning, the words would return, carved deeper, sharper, impossible to erase. One officer warned the warden, Sir, this isn't stopping them. It's uniting them. The warden didn't flinch. Then we'll show them unity means nothing. That night, the order was given. The loudspeaker crackled on, and every man in solitary heard the words. Tomorrow morning, the food stops. For everyone. Not just the loaf. Not just solitary. The entire prison. And as the announcement echoed through the halls, a sound rose from the cells. Not screams, not curses. Laughter. Dozens of voices laughing in the dark. The last starvation. The next morning, the prison was silent. No clatter of trays, no footsteps on the tier, no scrape of metal against steel doors. The food had stopped. Completely. At first, the silence felt unreal. Men pressed their faces to the bars, waiting, hoping it was a mistake. But hours passed. Then a day. Then another. The hunger was everywhere now. Not just in solitary, But in every block, strong men turned weak. Loud voices faded into whispers. Fights broke out over hidden crackers, a single stick of gum smuggled weeks before. The guards patrolled with masks on their faces, watching as prisoners collapsed, too weak to stand. Yet even as their bodies gave out, the message did not. Scratched into walls, whispered through vents, written in blood across the floors. We will not starve. By the 5th day, the prison was breaking apart. Some begged, some prayed, some screamed through the night. And yet, scattered through the halls, faint but unbroken, came the sound of laughter. The prisoners weren't laughing because they had won. They were laughing because even in the face of death, the system could not take away the one thing it wanted most: their will. The warden walked the tiers one last time. He looked at the faces staring back, gaunt, hollow, starving, but still defiant. And for the first time he saw it. He could break their bodies, but he could never break their hunger to resist. Meals meant to break you. Prison is supposed to take away freedom. But in America's harshest facilities, food itself becomes the weapon. Loaves that taste like mud. Days without meals. Punishments baked into bread. These weren't meals meant to feed. They were meals meant to break. And yet, through hunger, through pain, through starvation itself, the men refused to surrender. Because when survival is all you have left, even a loaf of bread can spark a war. So the question remains: if food can be turned into punishment, what else can be weaponized inside these walls? Because behind bars, nothing is simple. Not even a meal.